So let's go ahead and take a look at linear perspective. And let's understand some of the concepts of perspective, diminution, cone of vision, eye level, vanishing points, and converging parallels. So let's get into it. First, we should kind of talk a little bit about illusion, because that's what we're trying to do in drawing. All images that look real, which are on a flat two-dimensional surface, are just illusions of three-dimensional reality. There are lots of spatial illusions that help artists to achieve these, depthful images. Things like linear perspective, overlapping, transparency, interpenetration, atmospheric perspective, positioning on the picture plane, size relative, blah, 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 so many other things. So for us in drawing, the one which is probably the most important to learn in the beginning of the drawing class is something called linear perspective. And here, with this hyper-realistic painting by Nathan Walsh, you can see him first laying out the perspective of the actual painting prior to him painting it. Linear perspective defined basically means it's a type of perspective used by artists in which the relative size, shape, and position of objects are determined or drawn by imaginary lines that converge to a point on the horizon line. So let's look at some of the types of linear perspective. There's one-point perspective, two-point perspective, three-point perspective, multi-perspective, see all these different converging parallels, four-point perspective, and five-point perspective. But what we're really going to use in this particular course is one-point and two-point perspective, and occasionally maybe some three-point perspective, depending on what objects you have in front of you. Basic perspective concepts are based on the idea of diminution, and what that means is that shapes always appear smaller the further away they are from you, the viewer. So in order to create illusions of three-dimensional reality and volume, representational proportions and depth, it's critical to understand this concept. Here you can see obviously the trees getting smaller as they go back in space, and the telephone poles also getting smaller as they go back in space. Another idea that we have to kind of have an understanding of is something called cone of vision. It's sometimes also called cone of sight. And why it's important in perspective is that basically if you don't pay attention to it, you'll create really unusual looking drawings that don't seem right. So the definition of cone of vision is the visual region displayed by a drawing that relates to a person's normal vision without his or her peripheral vision. In linear perspective, the cone of vision is indicated with a 60-degree angle beginning at the station point. It's 30 degrees to the left and to the right of the line of sight. And this all will make sense. Don't freak out. None of this is important for you to know really right away, but I do want you to know that it exists. In linear perspective, proportion of the objects are drawn outside the cone of vision. Those become really distorted if you do those. So here's the important thing to remember. In a nutshell, the cone of vision is the area of sight, or the angle of sight. Why it's important is because it distorts your drawings if you don't actually use it conscientiously. So here you can see this table looks strange in comparison to this table. This feels like a table you might be able to place something on, whereas this feels like it's a wonky world in some way. Let's look at this one. Look how wonky this bed is. It's definitely, with your vanishing points too closely related to one another, they need to be further away from one another. And so this looks really strange. It distorts because these vanishing points here and here are too close to each other. Too close to each other. Do you see how far away these vanishing points are here? So if you look at this one, you'll see that this looks more believable and this one looks more believable, but notice that these are actually vanishing points that go off of your picture plane. You don't see them over here at all. You can see this one, but you don't see this one over here. So often you're going to find that Your vanishing points go off of your picture plane, and you have to sight every single one of those angles, which is why it's so important to get sighting down and sighting your angles accurately. You don't want to create distorted images. Anyway, we're not going to talk a lot about cone of vision because it's a complex idea, and we're not doing that kind of perspective, because in real perspective, in drawing one, what we're actually trying to do is have an understanding of the basics. And here are the basic components that you need to know to be able to do accurate linear perspective in drawing one. You need to know what a horizon line is, which is also known as your eye level. You need to know what a vanishing point is. You need to know what converging parallel lines are, which are sometimes also called orthogonal lines. Truthfully, I just call them converging parallel lines because that makes more sense. So let's talk about each one of these separately. Horizon line is the actual height of the viewer's eyes when looking at an object or an interior scene or an exterior scene. Horizon line generally refers to drawings that are outdoor, while eye level, which is also known as a horizon line, generally refers to those drawings that are indoor. Here we see the eye level, which again is the vantage point of the spectator, and it's also referred to as a horizon line, but here you can see the normal eye level view, here you see the worm's eye view, and here you see a bird's eye view. And they use this a lot in photography as well, in filmmaking. So an object that's above your eye level, you'll see the bottom of it. An object that's on your eye level, you won't necessarily see the top or the bottom. And then if it's below your eye level, then you're actually standing above the object looking down on it, and therefore you see the actual top of whatever that object is. Vanishing points. Vanishing points are an imaginary line on the horizon line in which 1, 2, and 3-point perspective, etc., goes back in space too. And your edges converge to that point. Do you see how all of these lines seem to be coming to this point and getting smaller and smaller as they come towards this point? That's the vanishing point. And you probably have seen this if you've ever stood on a railroad track and you look down the railroad track. You know, the railroad track seems to go on and on and on and then just come to a point. Well, that's the vanishing point. Converging parallel lines, or orthogonal lines, are parallel lines that come together towards a single vanishing point. So all of these lines that are going to this vanishing point that are parallel lines but are converging parallel lines are in fact the orthogonal lines that we're talking about. So those recede, they're parallel to one another, and they recede to a vanishing point. And they actually help the artist to maintain perspective in their drawings and paintings and ensure that there's a more realistic view of whatever it is that they're looking at. You may not have noticed these, but they're all over the place. If you see them in tiles, you see them in furniture. But what you need to know is this tile right here is the exact same size as this tile is down here. But it looks as though it's getting smaller because it's going back in space and it's converging, these parallel lines are converging to a vanishing point back here in space somewhere, out of sight of the room. The same thing's happening with the floor here. So those are the most important things that we're going to be doing, and then we're going to actually start to utilize them in doing 1-point perspective drawings, 2-point perspective drawings, and 3-point perspective drawings. But I want you to notice this 2-point perspective. Look at how wonky this box looks because this vanishing point and this vanishing point are too closely related to one another, and therefore they're actually out, they're a problem for our line of sight. If you really wanted to see a 2-point perspective box without this dramatic angle like this, then it would be, and the same thing's happening in this 3 perspective image, then you would have to have these vanishing points going off of the picture plane somewhere, most likely. All right, let's go to the next thing.